What did medieval peasants eat for breakfast? Hey guys, tonight we're starting off with a nice, cozy topic. Nothing too dramatic. No bloody battles, no awkward royal mistresses, no Habsburg jaws. Just breakfast. The most important meal of the day, as they say. So picture yourself, medieval edition. You're not a king, not a knight, not even a merchant with a fur hat and a suspiciously fancy beard. Nope, you're a peasant. You live in a little timber hut with a thatched roof, and if you're lucky, it's not currently leaking rainwater onto your head. You've got mud for floors, smoke lingering in the rafters, and a couple of chickens wandering around your feet because, of course, chickens live inside with you. Everyone did that. Very hygienic. And now it's morning. You've probably been awake since sunrise, because alarm clocks didn't exist and roosters are very punctual, if somewhat annoying. So you roll out of your hay-stuffed mattress, wipe the sleep out of your eyes, and what's for breakfast? Spoiler, it's not a cinnamon roll and a latte, porridge. The OG breakfast of Europe. If you asked a medieval peasant what they had for breakfast, 9 times out of 10, the answer would be some form of mush, gruel, pottage, porridge, whatever word makes you least excited about eating. Grain was the backbone of peasant diets. And when I say backbone, I mean 70 to 80% of calories came from it. Wheat if you were fancy, rye or barley if you were normal, oats if you were unlucky. They'd grind it up, boil it in water or milk if you actually had a cow, which was not guaranteed. And that was your breakfast. Thick, gloopy, not particularly seasoned, unless you had some onions or leeks hanging around. Imagine oatmeal, but sad. Now don't get me wrong. Sometimes this porridge wasn't half bad. If you had access to honey, and if the bees hadn't all mysteriously died off. Medieval edition, you might sweeten it a little. Or if you'd slaughtered a pig recently, you might throw in a bit of fat or lard. Congratulations, you've just invented medieval bacon-flavored gruel. Yum, and yes, it sounds boring. But the thing about porridge is, it was filling. You needed energy to go out and spend 12 hours hacking away at a frozen field with a hoe. Carbs were life for breakfast. Absolutely. Here's where things get fun. Alongside that porridge, peasants usually drank beer, or, to be specific, small ale, which was basically beer's weaker, slightly disappointing cousin. See, water was not exactly trustworthy. You could drink it straight from the well or river, but chances were, someone upstream had already dumped something gross in it, like sewage, or a dead pig. So, instead, people brewed weak ale at home. It was low in alcohol, but enough to kill bacteria. And yes, this was your standard breakfast drink. Imagine waking up, having a bowl of oat mush, and washing it down with a pint of warm, flat beer. Good morning, children, drank it too, because why not? It was safer than water, and the alcohol content was so low it wasn't really intoxicating. Unless, of course, you drank 6 pints, which, honestly, some people did. Bread. If you were lucky, the other breakfast staple was bread. But before you picture a fluffy loaf from a Parisian bakery, hold on. Medieval bread was rustic. It was dark, heavy, often gritty because the flour mills weren't great at keeping little bits of stone out. You could literally wear your teeth down eating this stuff. Dentists of the Middle Ages, if you can even call them that, must have had a field day. Wheat bread was a luxury, usually reserved for nobility. Rye, barley, and oat breads were more common for peasants. Sometimes baked into flat cakes, sometimes just lumps of dough shoved into the communal village oven. Yes, communal oven, because peasants usually didn't have their own. It took a lot of fuel to heat one, so the lord or the village might maintain a big oven that everyone used. You'd bring your lump of dough, pay a little fee, and come back later for your loaf, unless somebody else stole it, which happened. So if you were lucky enough to have bread in the morning, it was usually just a hunk of dark rye bread, maybe with a smear of lard if you had pigs, or cheese if your goat hadn't died yet. And yes, cheese for breakfast was totally normal. Cheese, eggs, and whatever you could scrounge cheese was a staple because it preserved milk. And cows, goats, and sheep all produced milk at different times of year, so you made cheese whenever you could. Fresh, crumbly cheese in spring, harder, aged cheese in winter. For peasants, cheese wasn't about luxury. It was calories and protein in a compact, portable form. Eggs were another breakfast possibility. Chickens were common, though not pampered like they are today. They mostly scavenged scraps and bugs. So eggs weren't necessarily abundant, but if you had them, they were breakfast material. Fried in a pan with a little fat, boiled or scrambled. Yes, scrambled eggs existed. Pretty familiar, actually. And then, of course, there was whatever else you happened to have lying around. Onions, leeks, peas, beans, apples, nuts. If it was edible and in season, it could show up at breakfast, which meant breakfast wasn't a set menu. It was more like, what do we actually have in the house this morning? Meat, forget about it now. Let's be clear. Meat for breakfast was not really a peasant thing. Bacon and sausage breakfasts are a Victorian fantasy. Peasants might have pork fat to flavor their porridge, but actual meat, like a slab of pork or beef, was rare. Most animals were too valuable alive. You wanted milk, eggs, wool, or muscle power, not an empty carcass. The only time you ate real meat at breakfast was after slaughtering an animal, usually in winter, and then everyone gorged on it for a few days before it spoiled. Otherwise, meat was salted and preserved, and probably not wasted on the morning meal. So no, your average medieval peasant was not frying up a full English breakfast every morning. Sorry to ruin the image. Fasting days and religious rules. The fun complication, religion. Christianity shaped the medieval calendar, and fasting rules were a big deal. On fast days, which, depending on the century, could be half the year, peasants weren't supposed to eat meat, dairy, or eggs, which meant breakfast options got even bleaker. Fish was technically allowed, but unless you lived near a river or coast, good luck. So, a lot of fasting day breakfasts were just bread, onions, and beer. The holy trinity of please let this day end quickly. And yes, some peasants bent the rules, or ignored them. But technically, breakfast was not just a matter of appetite. It was a matter of what day the church calendar said it was. Did they even call it breakfast? Here's the thing. The word breakfast didn't really exist in the way we think of it. Medieval people didn't always eat right after waking up. In fact, a lot of sources suggest peasants ate their first meal around mid-morning, after a few hours of work. The idea was, get up, tend the animals, start plowing, and then break for food. So in a way, their breakfast was actually brunch, which sounds fancier than it was. Again, we're talking about porridge and beer here, not avocado toast. The social side of breakfast wasn't just about food though. It was about community. Peasant families often ate together, usually from a single pot or bowl. Everyone dipped in with wooden spoons, or, if you were too poor for spoons, your hands. Hygiene standards were, let's say, relaxed. Sometimes, neighbors would gather for breakfast if they were working together in the fields. And in towns, people grabbed breakfast at markets or bakeries, buying hot pies, rolls, or pancakes from street vendors. Yes, medieval Europe had street food. Not bad, right? The contrast with nobility and, of course, because we can't resist, let's contrast this with the nobility. Rich people had breakfast too, though sometimes they called it breaking the fast after morning prayers. Their version might include white bread, fancy cheese, spiced wine, or roast meats. Basically, the medieval equivalent of a hotel buffet. Peasants, meanwhile, were still choking down mush, but honestly, they probably didn't feel deprived. Breakfast wasn't about luxury. It was about surviving another day of endless labor. Let's float over to another angle of this peasant breakfast story. Not just what they ate, but what it meant for their health, their teeth, and their entire outlook on life. Because yes, porridge, beer, and bread may not sound exciting, but they shaped the medieval body in ways we still talk about today. What medieval diets did to people so. We've got our peasants chewing on gritty bread, slurping porridge, and washing it down with warm beer. Sounds like a pretty bland existence, right? But let's talk about what that actually did to their bodies. Spoiler, it wasn't great. The carb avalanche. The medieval peasant diet was basically 24/7 carb loading. Bread, porridge, ale, repeat. Which sounds like heaven if you're a modern marathon runner. But peasants didn't have marathons. They had endless days of farm labor. So, in a way, it worked. But here's the twist. Protein was scarce. Peasants weren't exactly stacking plates of bacon or sipping protein shakes. That lack of protein meant people were shorter, thinner, and more prone to fatigue. If you stood next to a medieval peasant today, they'd probably be a head shorter and several sizes smaller in every direction. Not because they were genetically tiny, just because their diets didn't let them grow bigger. And then there was the vitamin situation. If you were lucky enough to have fresh fruit or vegetables, great. But winters were long, and scurvy was always lurking around the corner. Yes, scurvy, not just a pirate problem. Teeth, the silent victims. Remember the bread grit I mentioned? Yeah, let's come back to that. Milling grain in medieval Europe often meant using grindstones that shed little flakes of stone into the flour, which meant every loaf of bread was essentially edible sandpaper. Over time, this wore teeth down to stumps. Archaeologists digging up medieval skeletons often find teeth ground flat, with nerves exposed. Imagine trying to chew on rye bread with that situation. And, of course, no dentists. Well, unless you count that one guy with pliers. So breakfast wasn't just boring, it was actively sabotaging your dental health, which makes that morning pint of ale start to sound like pain relief, not just hydration. Breakfast as medicine. Here's where things get quirky. Medieval people didn't just eat breakfast for fuel. They thought about it in medical terms too. Remember, this was the age of humors. The idea that your health depended on balancing blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Delicious, so certain breakfast foods were considered hot or cold, wet or dry. Porridge, moist and comforting, good for balancing dryness. Onions, hot and pungent, supposedly helped clear phlegm. Cheese, heavy and binding, meaning it might cause constipation. But hey, at least it filled you up. Doctors, when they weren't busy bleeding you with leeches, had opinions on what made a healthy breakfast. Mostly, they recommended moderation, which is ironic, because moderation wasn't really an option if your pantry had exactly 2 things in it. Breakfast superstitions now. Let's drift into the more fun side. Breakfast superstitions. Medieval folks loved connecting food with luck, health, and even morality. Eating onions in the morning supposedly warded off evil spirits, and bad breath too, probably, so double bonus. Sharing your first piece of bread with someone was thought to build trust. Unless they stole it, in which case, not so much. Drinking ale before sunrise was sometimes frowned upon, but, of course, people did it anyway. And then there's the religious angle again. Some believed starting the day with prayers before food kept demons away from your meal, which makes sense when your meal was a questionable hunk of cheese and a half-warm ale. Seasonal breakfasts, here's something modern people forget. Medieval breakfasts changed with the seasons. In summer, you had fresh berries, milk, maybe, eggs. In winter, it was dried beans, hard cheese, salted bread, and more beer. Variety wasn't really a thing. It was survival-based dining, and sometimes breakfast wasn't eaten at all. If harvests failed, famine hit, or lords demanded higher taxes, peasants went hungry. There are records of entire villages surviving on acorns, boiled grass, or bread made with ground-up tree bark during bad years. Not exactly a 5-star menu. Breakfast for children, now kids. What did little medieval peasants eat before trudging off to? Well, not school, but probably sheep herding. Pretty much the same as adults. Gruel, bread, ale. Yes, children drank. Ale too, just the watered-down small beer kind. Milk was for babies and sometimes for the wealthy, not for everyday peasant kids. And while modern parents might stress over balanced breakfasts and vitamins, medieval parents were more concerned with, will my child survive to age 5? Honestly, with that diet, it's a fair question. Noble breakfast, flexing okay. Let's contrast again, because it's always fun. Nobles had more breakfast options, and they loved showing off. A medieval lord might start his day with white bread. A big flex, because refined flour was expensive. Fancy cheese, spiced wine, and maybe roasted meats. Some nobles even made a point of eating breakfast late, after attending church, to show they weren't greedy. Others skipped breakfast entirely, because fasting was trendy. Yes, fasting was a medieval wellness trend. Sound familiar? History does like to repeat itself. And then there were kings who went overboard. Records from royal courts list breakfasts with roasted swans, exotic fruits, and imported spices. Imagine waking up to cinnamon in the 1300s. That was basically like having truffle oil today. Breakfast as a class divider. This brings us to a bigger point. Breakfast wasn't just food. It was a class marker. What you ate first thing in the morning said a lot about who you were. Peasants ate to survive. Nobles ate to display wealth. Monks ate according to strict rules. Everyone's breakfast told a story. And this is one of those. Little things historians love, because by studying what people ate in the morning, we get a glimpse into their whole world. Their economy, their health, their beliefs, their struggles, all from a bowl of porridge. Peasant breakfast, archaeology quick. Side note, how do we even know all this? Well, archaeologists love digging through medieval trash pits. Broken pottery, animal bones, charred grains, all clues. Old records help too. manorial accounts listing what peasants owed their lords, church documents noting fast day rules, even medical texts rambling about porridge. So yes, we know about peasant breakfasts because someone in 1350 was nerdy enough to write, on this day, John the Miller had bread, ale, and onions. Thank you, John. You've kept us entertained 700 years later. Breakfast wasn't exciting. And that was the point. Let's zoom out. Was medieval breakfast exciting? Not really. Was it delicious? Probably not. But it didn't need to be. Breakfast was fuel. It got you through a day of endless farm work, or cart hauling, or weaving, or whatever kept your family alive. It was monotonous, predictable, sometimes grim. But there's a kind of comfort in that too. Every morning, same bowl, same bread, same ale. In a world full of war, plague, and feudal lords demanding taxes, at least breakfast was dependable. Breakfast as a social ritual, so we've chewed through the porridge and washed it down with beer. Great, but breakfast wasn't just about food. Like pretty much everything in the Middle Ages, it also came with social rules, hierarchies, and the occasional bit of village drama. Breakfast as a family. Most peasants ate breakfast with their family. Picture it, a smoky hut, one pot simmering over the fire, everybody gathered around with spoons. And by spoons, I mean maybe spoons. If you were poor enough, your spoon might be a shared one carved from wood. Or you were just using your hands. There wasn't this modern sense of individual plates or my food versus your food. Food was communal. One big pot of pottage or porridge, everyone dipping in. Mum, dad, kids, grandparents, whoever happened to be alive that year. Pets, 2 dogs and cats lurked nearby, grabbing scraps. Very hygienic. And here's the kicker. Medieval houses were small, 1 or 2 rooms at most. Privacy was non-existent. So your quiet breakfast included your siblings elbowing you, your goat bleating, your neighbor possibly walking in, and everyone breathing the same smoky air. Cozy in the worst way. Gender roles at the morning table now. Who actually made breakfast? Predictably, women. Mothers, daughters, and wives handled the cooking. Which, to be fair, wasn't an elaborate process. Breakfast usually just meant boiling grain or baking bread. Still, it was women's work. Men's job was more on the eat quickly. Go outside, plow the field until you collapse, side. Women often ate after serving everyone else, or while tending kids. Because patriarchy doesn't stop just because it's 5 a.m. And kids, well, they were expected to eat quickly and get to work too. No lingering over breakfast with cartoons in the background. If you were a 7-year-old in medieval Europe, you probably had sheep to herd. The village oven gossip hit. Where things get fun, many villages had a communal oven, because heating a full-size oven in your own house was fuel-intensive and expensive. So, peasants brought their dough to the lord's oven, paid a little fee, and collected bread later, which, of course, made the oven a social hotspot. People gathered, waited for their bread, and gossiped. Who's marrying who? Whose cow mysteriously wandered into whose field? Which family hasn't paid their tithe? So in a way, breakfast wasn't just eaten at home. It was baked in a place full of chatter, rumors, and low-key drama. And when you sat down with your hunk of bread later, you were also chewing over the latest village news. Alehouses and tavern breakfasts surprise. Peasants sometimes ate breakfast in alehouses. Yes, taverns were open in the morning. And yes, people went there, because why not? If you're starting your day with beer anyway, might as well do it in company. Taverns offered cheap bread, cheese, and of course, ale, for travelers, merchants, or anyone passing through. Taverns were the goat breakfast spot. Imagine starting your day in a dimly lit pub, sharing stale bread with strangers. Very atmospheric, and taverns weren't just for eating, they were hubs for hiring labor, making deals, and occasionally brawling. Though, to be fair, those were more evening activities. Breakfast taverns were usually mellow, just quiet chatter, clinking mugs, and everyone pretending to be awake. The monastic twistlets float over to monasteries for a second. Monks had a very specific breakfast culture, shaped by the rule of Saint Benedict and centuries of fasting rules. Monks often didn't eat until later in the morning, after prayers and work. Their breakfast might be bread, cheese, and watered wine, not far off from peasants, just more organized. And monks ate in silence. Literally, breakfast in a monastery was a quiet affair, with maybe a reading from scripture to keep everyone spiritually awake. So, while peasants gossiped at the oven and nobles flexed with spiced wine, monks just sat in a row, eating silently, trying not to fall asleep into their porridge. Breakfast and work rhythms. Here's something interesting. Breakfast timing was tied to work. For peasants, the first meal often came after a couple of hours of labor. You got up at sunrise, did chores, milked cows, mucked stables, and then ate. Which is why breakfast wasn't the most important meal of the day. It was more like a mid-morning pit stop. For artisans in towns, it was different. A blacksmith might eat something quick at dawn, and then again at mid-morning. Bakers obviously had weird hours. They were up all night, so their breakfast might happen when everyone else was having dinner. And nobles, well, nobles sometimes considered breakfast optional. They might go straight into hunting, court duties, or just lounging in bed. Breakfast for them was more about showing status than fueling labor. Breakfast as hospitality. Breakfast also had a role in hospitality. If you hosted travelers, you were expected to give them breakfast before they left. Bread, ale, maybe cheese. Nothing extravagant, but it showed basic courtesy. Failing to provide breakfast could make you look stingy or inhospitable. In a world where your reputation mattered and gossip spread fast, feeding guests in the morning was basically good PR. When breakfast was politically a say, even breakfast could get political. Lords and kings sometimes hosted morning feasts for visiting dignitaries, using breakfast to impress. Imagine sitting down at 8 a.m. and being handed roast venison and spiced wine. Nothing says diplomacy like indigestion before noon, and sometimes breakfast was used symbolically. Breaking bread together in the morning meant trust, friendship, or sealing an agreement. Which sounds nice, until you remember that medieval politics was basically smile at breakfast, stab at lunch. Street food breakfasts in towns and towns. Breakfast got more interesting. Street vendors sold hot pies, pancakes, and rolls to workers on their way to jobs. Yes, medieval Europe had fast food. Not McDonald's, but similar vibes. Quick, cheap, probably questionable hygiene. Apprentices, journeymen, and laborers might grab a meat pie or a sweet cake from a stall before heading to the workshop. So, in urban areas, breakfast was a little more varied and maybe even tasty. Breakfast as a quiet constance through all of this. Peasants, nobles, monks, taverns, vendors, breakfast remained one of the few predictable things in medieval life. War, plague, famine, taxes. Those changed everything, but breakfast. It was always bread, porridge, ale, repeat. There's a strange comfort in that. Imagine waking up in 1348, hearing rumors of plague in the next village, watching the sky turn grey, and still sitting down to the same lump of porridge your ancestors ate. Breakfast was continuity in a very unstable world. The strangest medieval breakfast, so picture medieval Europe. It's a world where breakfast is usually boring, predictable, and endlessly beige bread, porridge, beer. Repeat until death. But every once in a while, people spiced it up. Sometimes literally, sometimes metaphorically, and sometimes in ways that make you wonder how anyone survived past childhood when meat appeared at breakfast. Let's start with the rich people flex. Occasionally, nobles would eat meat for breakfast. And not just any meat, sometimes leftover venison, roast pork, or even swan. Because what's the point of owning half the countryside if you can't eat a bird so rare it's technically property of the king? For peasants, meat at breakfast was basically a holiday miracle. You might get bacon scraps, maybe a piece of salted pork stirred into porridge, but full and roasted meat in the morning. Forget it. That was elite territory. And yet, we have records of some kings and dukes eating enormous meat-heavy breakfasts. Which, yes, sounds luxurious, but also slightly terrifying. Imagine washing down greasy pork with warm spiced wine before 9 a.m. Your digestive system would write a formal complaint. Spices, if you could afford them now, spices. For most peasants, spice meant salt. If you had that, you were good. But nobles sometimes went overboard with cinnamon, cloves, nutmeg, and ginger in their morning food. Imported from the Middle East or Asia, spices were so expensive they were basically edible status symbols. Did cinnamon porridge taste amazing? Probably. Was it worth the insane price? Hard to say, but it definitely made breakfast feel less like survival food and more like a medieval brunch special. Honey, the medieval sweetener. If you wanted something sweet, you didn't have sugar, unless you were super rich. Sugar was rare and pricey, but honey was everywhere. Peasants sometimes drizzled honey on bread or stirred it into pottage for a rare treat. Nobles loved it too, not just in porridge, but also in mead. And monks kept bees, making honey one of the few things both peasants and elites could enjoy in a similar way. So, yes, medieval breakfast could occasionally be sweet, but it was bed-dependent eggs. The flexible morning food eggs were the medieval wild card. Chickens were common, so eggs were too. But here's the thing. People didn't always eat them casually. Eggs were tied up with fasting rules, church prohibitions, and seasonal availability. When allowed, though, eggs showed up boiled, fried, or baked into pies. Nobles might even have fancy egg dishes with herbs and spices. Peasants, just a boiled egg, maybe with bread. It's simple, it's filling. And it's one of the few things that feels recognizably breakfast-like to us today. Fishy mornings because the church loved its fasting days. Fish sometimes replaced meat in breakfasts. In coastal towns, you might start your morning with herring, cod, or shellfish. Inland peasants often got salted or pickled fish if they could afford it. So yes, imagine rolling out of bed and immediately being greeted by a slab of cold salted herring. Delicious? Maybe not. Traditional? Absolutely. And monks, of course, ate tons of fish for breakfast on fasting days, which explains why monastic records include more fish than most modern cookbooks. Cheese and dairy was a weird one. On one hand, it was everywhere. Cows, sheep, and goats all provided milk. On the other hand, fresh milk spoiled fast, which is why cheese and butter were so popular. For peasants, cheese was often breakfast food, eaten with bread or porridge. It was simple, portable, and lasted longer than fresh milk. Nobles had access to richer varieties, sometimes soft, sometimes spiced. And let's be honest, a hunk of cheese and a hunk of bread was probably one of the better breakfasts you could hope for in medieval Europe. The accidental breakfast, okay. Let's get into the truly weird stuff. Accidental breakfasts. Peasants sometimes ate whatever was lying around. Roots dug up from fields, wild berries, nuts, or even chestnuts roasted on a fire. Kids in particular foraged while walking to work or school, and sometimes accidental breakfast meant leftovers that weren't meant for humans, like animal feed. Barley, mash, bran, or even turnip tops might sneak into the pot, because when food was scarce, breakfast wasn't about taste. It was about survival. Breakfasts of desperation during famines. Breakfast could get grim. People ate bark, acorns, and bread made from ground-up peas or beans mixed with sawdust like filler. Yes, famine bread was real. It wasn't nutritious. It wasn't tasty. But it technically kept you alive. And this is where breakfast stopped being just a meal and became a daily reminder of hardship. Imagine waking up to a chunk of black, bitter bread and calling that fuel for the day. Suddenly, porridge doesn't sound so bad, sweet. Drinks and odd beverages. We can't forget drinks. Yes, beer was common, but sometimes people had mead, cider, or watered wine at breakfast. Nobles might even drink mulled wine in the morning, because nothing says I'm wealthy like spices floating in your alcohol before sunrise. And there's one odd mention of almond milk as a breakfast item. Almond milk was a luxury in Europe, imported and expensive, but it was especially popular during fasting periods when dairy was banned. Nobles sometimes had almond milk porridge, which sounds fancy until you realize it was basically medieval oat milk with extra steps. The weirdest of all, animal oddities and, finally, the strangest recorded breakfast items, animal parts. Some medieval texts mention things like tripe, liver, or blood sausage being eaten in the morning. Not common, not widespread, but definitely a thing. In Scandinavia, breakfasts sometimes included fermented fish or blood pancakes. In England, black pudding made appearances. And yes, it was as heavy on the stomach as it sounds. So, while most mornings were porridge and beer every so often, someone, somewhere was starting their day with pig's blood and onions. Because why not? Breakfast for the sick on last curve. Special breakfasts for the sick. Medieval medical texts often recommended broth, gruel, or even watered wine for invalids. Some physicians prescribed eggs or sweetened almond milk for delicate stomachs. So if you were lucky enough to have a doctor's advice, your breakfast might look more like baby food, which honestly wasn't that different from normal porridge, just softer and sadder, wrapping the weirdness. So yes, medieval breakfast was usually boring. But sometimes it was meat-heavy, sometimes sweetened with honey, sometimes spiced like a mini-feast, and sometimes horrifyingly experimental. And through all of it, people still called it the least important meal of the day. They saved their real energy for dinner. Breakfast was just a thing. A slightly strange, sometimes questionable, always necessary thing. Breakfast across medieval worlds, so far. We've mostly been hanging out in Western Europe, imagining peasants. gnawing on rye bread while nobles argued over whether swan counted as finger food. But the medieval world was bigger than that. Breakfast, like everything else, depended a lot on where you were. And trust me, it wasn't all barley porridge. England, beer and bread. Forever, let's start with England, since it's basically the poster child for boring medieval breakfast. The typical English peasant morning, ale and bread. Sometimes pottage, sometimes cheese. Occasionally bacon if pigs were generous that year. The nobility, of course, piled on extras, eggs, venison, fish. Monks in England had particularly hearty breakfasts, despite all those vows of humility. The stereotype of monks sneaking in a second breakfast. Yeah, that wasn't entirely wrong, so. England gave us the classic medieval image: a round loaf, a mug of ale, and a resigned sigh before trudging off to plough a field. France, the slightly fancier neighbor, crossed the channel, and France starts flexing. French peasants still stuck to bread, but their bread was often wheat-based if they were lucky, lighter and tastier than the darker rye loaves of the English poor. The upper classes in France leaned into buttery pastries, not quite croissants, yet but heading in that direction. There are records of nobles eating spiced cakes or honeyed breads in the morning. It was less about filling your stomach, more about showing that you could afford luxury carbs. So while England was dunking rye bread in ale, French nobles were already halfway to inventing brunch. Italy, wine in the morning. Sure, in Italy, breakfast, or colazione, was basically an excuse to drink wine first thing in the morning. Sometimes watered, sometimes not. Bread was always there, of course, but Italy had olive oil, grapes, figs, and more access to Mediterranean goodies. Nobles in Italy could splash out on cheese, fruit, and even almonds or honey at breakfast. Meanwhile, peasants kept it simple with bread soaked in wine, which, honestly, sounds like a medieval wine, spritzer. So, Italy's breakfast was a little lighter, a little sweeter, and a lot more wine-fueled. Scandinavia, fish, and fermented surprises. Let's head north, where mornings were rougher. Scandinavian breakfasts leaned heavily on fish, salted herring, dried cod, sometimes fresh trout. And yes, sometimes fermented fish, which is basically the medieval ancestor of breakfast that scares tourists. Bread was there too, but often flatbread, made from barley or rye. Butter and cheese were common as well, because dairy was everywhere in the north. If you picture a Norse farmer eating dried fish with butter on flatbread while squinting at the sunrise, you're basically there. Cozy in its own way, but not exactly a cinnamon latte. The Middle East, a totally different vibe. Meanwhile, the medieval Islamic world had a very different take on mornings. Instead of beer and rye bread, breakfasts might include flatbread with olive oil, dates, figs, yogurt, and sometimes spiced lentils. Honey and nuts showed up often, along with cheese and fresh fruits. Coffee wasn't yet widespread in Europe, but in the Middle East, people were already experimenting with it by the late medieval period. Imagine how unfair that felt, while Europeans were choking down cold porridge. Someone in Damascus might have been sipping an early proto-coffee. So yes, Middle Eastern breakfasts were healthier, tastier, and less likely to leave you bloated. Before noon, monks and nuns everywhere, monastic communities had their own rules. Breakfast was sometimes skipped, sometimes light, sometimes hearty, depending on the order. But monks wrote everything down, so we know they were eating bread, cheese, and fish regularly. And let's be real, monks had access to better food than most peasants, even while pretending to live simply. A Benedictine monk might complain about fasting while chewing salted salmon and sipping imported wine. The hypocrisy was real, but at least breakfast was steady. Children, the forgotten breakfasters, across all these regions, kids got the short end of the stick. Breakfast for children was often just smaller portions of adult food, bread, porridge, or weak beer. Milk, when available, went mostly to children, but it wasn't seen as a permanent food. And in poorer families, kids might go without breakfast entirely, straight to the fields or workshops on an empty stomach. So much for the most important meal of the day. Why breakfast barely mattered here's the thing. In medieval culture, breakfast wasn't celebrated the way it is today. It wasn't Instagrammable. It wasn't considered a family moment. It was just fuel. Dinner was the big deal. Dinner was social, ceremonial, political, luxurious. Breakfast was survival. Bread, beer, and a prayer you wouldn't starve by lunchtime, which is why so many sources barely mention it. The medieval chroniclers didn't care what peasants ate at sunrise. They cared about kings at banquets, dukes feasting, nobles spilling wine on velvet. Breakfast was invisible, and that's why reconstructing it feels like piecing together a sleepy jigsaw puzzle. So, after all this, what did medieval peasants eat for breakfast? Most mornings, bread, sometimes porridge, often beer. Occasionally, cheese or bacon scraps. On rare days, honey, eggs, or even meat. In hard times, roots, nuts, or famine bread. Nobles and monks had fancier spreads, but even then, it was never as important as the meals later in the day. In short, medieval breakfast was simple, repetitive, and occasionally strange. It kept people alive, but it never stole the spotlight. Sleepy farewell, and that's where we'll leave it tonight. From the rye loaves of England to the spiced breads of France, the wine-soaked mornings of Italy to the salted fish of Scandinavia. Medieval breakfasts were as varied as the people who ate them, but always practical, always humble. So next time you sip your morning coffee or grumble about burnt toast, just remember, it could be worse. You could be gnawing on cold herring with a mug of sour ale at sunrise. Thanks for drifting through this with me. Close your eyes, rest easy, and let's leave the porridge pots simmering in the past. Good night.